So welcome to our 7th lecture of solar electric energy systems. We will discuss today about the market development. We talk about off-grid markets for PV, market triggered by feed-in tariff, FIT, self-sustainable markets, and the actual cost and price development of photovoltaics. Here you see the share of renewable power plants added to the global capacity of power plants. So you see here that 80% of all new power plants are now renewables and 48% are photovoltaics. On the already installed capacity, renewable energy power plants besides photovoltaics amount for 23% of the total capacity, while photovoltaics amount 2.6% of all installed power plants. So still a long way to go despite quite impressive installation numbers. Here you see the very latest numbers from the year 2020. So the total amount of installed PV capacity was 760 gigawatt under standard test conditions, and in 2010 139 gigawatts have been installed alone. So we are approaching pretty fast the 1 terawatt mark. If you take a look which countries installed those, so at the first side you see that of one of this new installed 139 gigawatts, 35% have been installed by China, 14% by the United States, 8% by Vietnam. That's quite impressive, especially if you see the next 23%, which is divided up for 6% to Japan, 4% only in Germany. So Vietnam installed about double than Germany, followed by India 3%, Australia 3% of the world market, Korea, South Korea 3% of the world market, Brazil 2%, Netherlands 2%. Here you see until 2019 the division of the new installation in regions. So you see here up to the year 2011-2012, Europe has been dominating that market. If you look for example at 2011, so there were about 3/4 have been installed in Europe, mainly in Germany, but quickly followed by Italy and Spain. Then the legislation changed, especially in Germany, and it wasn't so attractive anymore. So most of the installations occurred in China. China already in the year 2010, 2011 was producing most of the PV modules, but then they started also to install. And as I mentioned, in the year 2020, 35% of all PV installation has been made in China. If we go to the total installed numbers, we saw this graph already, but this time is now split up in region. You see here that Europe, despite relatively low installation numbers, still about 1/4 or 1/5 of the world's PV capacity. China just overtook Europe some years ago, but also North and South Americas are quickly ramping up installation. Here exactly you see the relative share of the different regions on the world market from 2012 up to 2019. You see here that in 2012, 70% of the world market had been installed in Europe, while nowadays it's only 24%. And China, as we heard before, it was 35% in 2020, and in 2019 it was 32%. Here you see a pie graph of all power plants, no matter of what type, installed in 2019 in the terms of nominal capacity. You have to consider the capacity factor there also, because photovoltaic power plants, they don't deliver energy 24 hours, but still it's quite impressive. So the very most power plants were photovoltaic power plants in 2019 with 116.9 gigawatts, followed by wind 61 gigawatts, followed by gas power plants 30 gigawatts, then coal power plants, hydropower plants with 15 gigawatts, and other types of renewable energies with 5 gigawatts. You don't see here nuclear power plants. There were some installation of nuclear power plants in 2019, but during that time more nuclear power plants has been dismantled and then set up new ones. So the total amount was minus 5 gigawatts. Therefore, they don't appear in that pie graph. Here you see the price development of photovoltaics. In the 80s to the 90s, prices have been in the vicinity of 20 euros per watt peak of a solar module. They went down drastically. On the x-axis, you see the cumulated installed capacity. So there have been only some megawatts installed in the year 2000. Finally, 1 gigawatt has been installed. Price was still pretty high in the vicinity of 4 euro per watt peak. Then, due to the vast improvements of production facilities and the increasing world market, you see here that the installed capacity 20-fold, 30-fold about only 10 years, and prices went down to about 2 euros per watt peak. Nowadays we are in between 20 and 30 euro cents per watt. So that's quite impressive. So costs went down almost by a factor of 100. In total, we can say we have about minus 24, some people say also minus 25% in price reduction, while doubling the installed capacity. So that's the x-axis here. This is also some impact on the share of the different components of a PV system. While in 2006, this Q4 means quarter 4, so it's the last quarter of 2006, the share had been that 71% of the cost of a PV system has been due to the PV modules, and only 29% had been allocated due to the BOS costs, the balance of systems costs. So it means wiring, the mounting structure, and the inverter. Nowadays, this changed completely. If you go to the year 2019, you see that only 39% of the costs has been allocated to the modules, and 61% of the costs are BOS costs, including the inverter. That means it makes much more sense, if you want to save costs, to take a look at the BOS costs, because the PV module costs are pretty much squeezed out and they don't amount so much at your final costs of your PV installation and finally of your electricity bill. These are for relatively small rooftop systems in the vicinity of 10 to 100 kilowatt. If you take a look at a large scale installation, you have the same tendency, but the absolute numbers are different. This is quite interesting. This is from a study from Mr. Hoffmann in the year 2000. You see that in the year 2000, in Germany, which is about 900 full load hours, these are full load hours, or this is about 1000 kilowatt hours per square meter per year of solar irradiance. Then costs had been in the vicinity of 60 euro per kilowatt hour. If you go to a more southern locations, for example Portugal or southern Spain or northern Africa, you would have the double of irradiance, or in other words 1800 full load hours of your nominal installed capacity of PV modules, and that led to a price of 30 euro cent per kilowatt hour. This was still far from the electricity prices. Here in blue you have a baseload prices, and you have the peak load price in the red color, but still even the most expensive peak load power plants has been cheaper than photovoltaic power plants. So without subsidies, or let's say a special feed-in tariff, this wasn't possible. So during that time, I will explain you later, you get an extra premium tariff for feeding in your PV electricity into your grid. And then it was expected that in the year 2009 or so, there would be grid parity, at least for southern location, with the peak load power plants, and if Germany would have to wait for the year 2020 to reach the costs of peak load, or the most expensive peak load power plants, and until the year 2030 to really reach in the vicinity of baseload power plants. The actual development was much more positive. You see that in the year 2010 already, prices drop drastically. So you see here that even Germany reached the cost of grid electricity produced by peak load power plants already in the year 2010, 2011. And the southerly location even reached baseload costs. So in 2015, prices were down to 10 cents per kilowatt hour in Germany and to 6 cents per kilowatt hour for southerly locations. The latest numbers in 2021 are prices, the last tenders, of about 4 cents, exactly 3.9 cents per kilowatt hour in Germany, and Saudi Arabia was even a little bit below 1 cent per kilowatt hour, euro cent, a little bit more, 1.03 cent per kilowatt hour. So that means you have baseload parity. Even more, if you compare this only to thermal energy, so if you just burn a fossil fuels, you are in the same vicinity. You also have cost between 1 and 2 euro cents per kilowatt hour. And this is for electricity. This kind of energy is much more valuable than the thermal energy. So that was a really enormous success. Also, thanks to this feed-in tariff, what you see here. So, as I mentioned already, in the year 2000 up to the year 2010, photovoltaic wasn't competitive with grid tariffs. So there was kind of subsidy. So you get an extra tariff, which had been in the vicinity of 50 up to 56 cents per kilowatt hour for small power plants. For bigger power plant, this tariff has been smaller. And then it slowly decreased at a fixed rate. So it was easy for investors to invest in photovoltaic production facilities, because they knew, okay, when my factory is ready in 2 years, I will still have a quite good feed-in tariff, and I will still sell my modules because they still will operate with profit. And this scenario totally changed in 2011. There, the government, there was a Liberal Democrat, Mr. Rösler there, and he decided, oh no, this photovoltaic, they gain too much. We have to drastically decrease the so-called feed-in tariff. This led to some problems in the investment area, because the banks suddenly stopped financing not only PV power plant projects, but also they took off the money in the production facilities. And so most of the production facilities in Germany failed, and so only 1-2 remained, and the rest now is produced in China. Then the government saw that, okay, this was too drastic. Then they changed the type of feed-in tariff according to the installed installation numbers. So they made a channel in the vicinity of 2.5 to 3 gigawatt per year. If it's more than that, then the feed-in tariff will go down. If it's less than that, then the feed-in tariff will go up. And this you see here during the last year. Okay, this might helpful to fulfill this tunnel, but for the long-term investment planning, either of a PV power plant operator or an investor in a manufacturing facility, this is not totally helpful, because he has to have a longer perspective of at least 10 years. He has to know what will be the prices in about 10 years in order to calculate his factory. And also for the banks especially, if there is some risks involved, for example, the feed-in tariff, they drastically increase their interest rates. And this leads to higher costs for the factory as well as higher costs for the PV modules. And this makes even European products less competitive compared to Chinese modules, where the feed-in tariff doesn't have these fluctuations. Here you have the different feed-in tariff. So this is gross domestic electricity price in red, and gray squares. This is electricity price for a small industry. This is a bit cheaper than the household tariffs. This is a quite interesting graph. You see the x-axis, the total price of your PV power plant. So you see also on this graph the dashed line. So here, parallel line to the x-axis, this represents the feed-in tariff for small PV power plants up to 10 kilowatts rooftop mounting. So this was a little bit above 8 euro cent per kilowatt hour. And here the lower line is for larger systems up to 100 kilowatt. This is a bit above 6 euro cent per kilowatt hour. So if you install your power plant for the price of 1 euro per watt peak and you are located in Freiburg, these are the colored lines here. So the red line is for Freiburg with an yearly irradiance of 1,200 kilowatt hours per square meter per year. Then some, for example, as Berlin, the yellow line, this is 1,050, 1,088 kilowatt hours per square meter per year. And the gray line is about Paderborn at about an irradiance of 950 to 980 kilowatt hours per square meter per year. So let's take a look at 1 euro per watt peak. So you see here that for Freiburg, you achieve prices here, if you install it for that price, a little bit below 7 euro cent per kilowatt hour. That means if you compare it to a small system where you get a remuneration of a bit above 8 euro cent per kilowatt hour, that is profitable. If you install a larger system for that price, you're not profitable because you would only get a little bit more than 6 euro cent per kilowatt hour, while your costs are in the vicinity of 7 euro cent per kilowatt hour. So this doesn't make sense. So you should decrease your costs to at least 90 euro cents per watt. So you would be here at the threshold of profitability. For Paderborn, it's worse. So in order to be profitable at small scale power plants, you should be in the vicinity of 95 cent per watt peak. For small power plants, your prices should be in the vicinity of 70 cent per watt in order to be profitable. So that's quite a good graph to quickly overview whether your power plant can be profitable in terms of PV power plant price. This is a cost development of different electricity supply options. So I mentioned in the year 2010, so on, the costs of PV electricity has been rather expensive. So in 2010, photovoltaic was much more expensive than all other energy options. But this changed in the year 2013 until 2015. So photovoltaic became from the most expensive energy option to the cheapest energy option in 2019 with only 4 US cent per kilowatt hour. While the other energy costs, wind power went also a little bit down, but nowadays is a bit more expensive than solar power. It depends also on the location. If you see coal power plant, it remained constant, even there is a slight increase in costs. Especially you see this increase in terms of nuclear power plants. So the latest numbers here from the new nuclear power plant in the UK and Finland, they amount about to 15.5 euro cent per kilowatt hour, including all costs. Here you see the different supply options. So this is worldwide. In Germany, usually we achieve cheaper prices due to the higher experience in photovoltaics. So residential PV worldwide costs vicinity of 20 US cent per kilowatt hour. The larger scale power plants here, this is commercial and industry power plants, this is in the vicinity of 10 euro cents per kilowatt hour. For utility scale PV, you're in the vicinity of $4 per kilowatt hour. As I mentioned, in Saudi Arabia, there was even tenders in the vicinity of 1 cent per kilowatt hour. So, but this is worldwide average. So some locations are more expensive, some are less expensive. Here you have combined gas power plants. So they're also quite cheap. And coal power plants nowadays are more expensive than utility scales photovoltaics. This was also the reason that even during the government of Trump, more photovoltaic power plants have been installed than coal power plants. Because it was cheaper, not about carbon dioxide, not about climate protection, just it was a matter of price. So I mentioned already, nuclear even increased in price. Then you have utility scale PV combined with storage. Sure, it's a bit more expensive than just feeding electricity into the grid during daytime. And here you have the gas peaker, which you can combine with utility scale photovoltaics. This makes this also a possibility to substitute storage. You can even oversize photovoltaics to use gas peakers as little as possible because they have a significantly higher production price than photovoltaics. These are some examples of the tenders in 2019. As I mentioned already, they went even down, but you see differences of the different countries. So as I mentioned, in Portugal, there was a price of 1.5 euro cent per kilowatt hour or 1.65 US dollar cents per kilowatt hour. Then the Emirates 1.7 and so on. But all in the vicinity of 2 euro cents per kilowatt hour seems to be feasible all around the world. This PPA, this is called a power purchase agreement. This could be either tenders, but this is basically a contract which you as an operator of a PV power plant sign to the utility, and you say, for example, I will deliver solar electricity for 25 years for that price. In some countries that's inflation compensated, in some countries not. As I mentioned here already, Saudi Arabia, 1 euro cent, below 1 euro cent per kilowatt hour, or in other words, 0.01404 US dollar cent per kilowatt hour. Let's come to the business models. There appeared a new keyword, so-called prosumer. That's the middle between consumer and production. So this is now if you have a photovoltaic power plant on your roof, you consume energy, for example, during nighttime if you don't have a storage, and you produce energy during daytime. What you can do, as we saw by the prices, nowadays you pay about 30 cents per kilowatt hour for electricity from the grid, but you only, as you saw, get in the vicinity of 8 cents per kilowatt hour from the utility. So it makes perfectly sense to consume as much as possible of your own generated electricity. You can even go further and not using the public grid anymore, so you kind of as a large storage even for seasonal changes to be free of the public grid. So you can have individual self-consumption with storage and energy management system. Sure, it best is if you won't use the storage, so you just arrange, for example, the charging of your electric cars to the daytime where you have cheap photovoltaic electricity available. If you have to go via intermediate storage, it's doubling the price at least. So you even can extend that to not only one household, but to one building with several households, or go even further. You can set up a microgrid which contains several buildings and have solar and storage. And this also gets cheaper because if you buy a large storage, for example, usually that's cheaper than a small storage. Plus you have some equalization effects of the households because one is staying at home, one goes to work and so on. This helps to reduce actually the storage cost necessary. You can still use the public grid. So you can do the same actually, have collective self-consumption with solar and the energy management system at the neighborhood level. Also you can do using the public grid for peer-to-peer trading. So you going on holidays, you have a huge PV power plant on your roof and you say, okay, the feed-in tariff is very low. Maybe I can use the public grid to sell that electricity to my neighbor. That's quite difficult. The utilities don't like that, but I think it is a model for the future. So you pay something, sure, maybe 1 cent or so for the use of the grid, and you sell the electricity to your neighbor, which doesn't go on holiday and which will use your PV electricity. Also, you can provide flexibility service. This becomes more and more important, especially when we take a look at the battery later. So we can aggregate solar capabilities and storage capabilities and form a so-called virtual power plant with a very high capacity factor. If you sign a PPA with utilities and don't have a special premium tariff or a feed-in tariff, then they pay according not only to the electricity in general, but to the availability of the electricity or the capacity factor. And if you combine several power plants, which equalize them out a little bit, but especially if you apply storage, you are able to achieve a capacity factor of almost 1. And there you can achieve a much higher price for the utility you sell electricity for. Plus, you can offer some flexibility services because you have storage available. So you can say, okay, I can deliver electricity whenever you need it. And also I can digest some electricity when too much electricity is available on the grid. And this is called flexibility. This is very much necessary due to the increasing number of wind and solar power plants and due to the merit order structure. The actual grid becomes more inflexible. We come to this merit order a little bit later. Here you see the perspective of rooftop solar. You see that this was done in 2018, so 2019, 2020 was still future. So it's expected that rooftop until the year 2023 will amount, even in a low scenario, 44 gigawatts worldwide, or in an optimistic scenario, 76.5 gigawatts. For the utility scale large solar power plants, the pessimistic scenario is at 81.7 gigawatt and the optimistic scenario 187.4 gigawatt. So this was the outlook. Now we have the numbers already for 2020. So we have a total installed number of 760 gigawatt in total. So this is a bit more than it was expected. For your homework, you have to calculate the time it needs until you can install a PV capacity sufficient to feed the whole world only with PV electricity. And therefore you need some numbers of increase of growth of PV installed capacity, and this you can take from some years, but it is all given in the exercise. Some people say, okay, photovoltaic electricity is making my electricity bill very expensive. Yes, this was true in the year 2000 up to 2010. So this is the amount. If you install an additional 1 gigawatt of PV power plants, how much your electricity bill will increase. And for example, for the year 2007, 1 gigawatt of photovoltaic power plant increased your electricity bill by 0.1 cents per kilowatt hour you consumed. Or in other words, if you install 10 gigawatts, then your electricity bill will increase by 1 cent per kilowatt hour. This is not anymore the case. Now the rates are really, really low, go even down to 0 if you continue that line. Unfortunately, there was no new graph available. And even while photovoltaic electricity got so cheap, they can lead to negative number. That means they can lower your electricity bill if the flexibility is given. Here you see first the traditional structure of the power production in Germany. So you had baseload power plants which had been very cheap, but they had to operate for 24 hours, 365 days a year, basically nuclear power plants or lignite power plants. The middle power plant, these have been smaller hard coal power plants. They show some kind of dynamic capabilities or flexibilities. They operate at a bit higher costs, but they offer this kind of small flexibility. While the most dynamic power plants have been gas power plants or gas peakers. They were the most expensive one, but they could cope with the fluctuations during midday or during evening. You didn't use them a lot because they were relatively expensive. Now you see this yellow part. This is a clear day PV power output. This is already some years ago. Now this is even increased. The gray line is some bad day power plant production. And this, if you consider a clear day, this led that the production during midday was not necessary anymore because photovoltaics supplied that electricity. So this led to the fact that the peak power plants, the gas power plants, were not necessary at midday anymore, and so they are only operated in the evening hours. So the operating time of those power plants became less and making them more expensive even. They have been already very expensive, but they became even more expensive. Due to the structure of the purchase of our electricity, the so-called merit order structure, these power plants, which are most flexible, are the most expensive one. So they come last here, while the most inflexible power plants, for example, here lignite power plants or nuclear power plants, are the cheapest. They are not so cheap as they appear on this graph because the government is taking care on the insurance costs, which would be rather high, and finally the cost would be rather high, but here it's considered as very cheap. And also here the lignite costs, also not considering significant amount of carbon dioxide costs. This was 2018. There was the carbon dioxide prices have been really low there. This increased also now quite a lot. But even considering that, so this lead to very low costs here, and these were purchased first. So if you see here a red bar, so if you would need a power of 32 gigawatt during that time, you would first get the waste energy, was virtually for free, then all the nuclear power and all the lignite power, and only a small part of the hard coal power. And your energy structure here is not flexible at all, only have some flexibility to the hard coal power. This leads to, if you have fluctuations in wind or solar, this leads that the purchased capacities during that time are not flexible at all and can't react to fluctuations. From a dynamic point of view, it would make much more sense to include some gas turbine. They can be ramped up in some minutes, latest generation in 5 minutes. Carbon dioxide emissions is also half compared to lignite or coal power plants, but they wouldn't be switched on because they are not considered, because after 32 gigawatts, the rest here is disconsidered. So there should be also some kind of flexibility bonus in order to make the whole electricity systems more flexible in order to avoid overproduction. Here you see such an example of overproduction. So you see here the conventional power plants here operating, and in yellow the solar power plants, and in light green the wind power plants. You see here that here there was a lot of solar power available, also some wind power, but the fossil power plants or the conventional power plants were not able to throttle down sufficiently. This led to overproduction and therefore to negative electricity prices, as you see here. Same for a day later, same situation, because there was no flexibility in the grid. Here you have some positive, okay, during that time there was some wind power but no solar power. But in general, prices on the stock exchange for electricity in Leipzig were very low during the last years. This may sound very positive, but on the other hand, this led to the situation that there were no investment in the energy sectors anymore. So no investments in flexibility and so on. Also, while the premium tariff still has to be paid for the operators of the solar power plants, the cost differences increased because the revenue by the stock exchange was almost zero or even negative. And finally, while the households had to pay for this premium tariff, or at least for the difference prices by law, these led to an increase in electricity prices. It's a bit strange situation. You have to think twice about it. So the reduction, the increase in price differences led to an increase in electricity prices due to the low electricity, negative prices on the electricity exchange. Here you see more detailed structure. You see that the hard coal power plants were able to follow the load curve a little bit. The lignite power plants not at all. They always operate constantly. Same as in red. The nuclear power plants, they didn't change their power at all, even if there were high fluctuations. The biomass power plants, they could change theoretically, but there was a problem of the monitoring because these are relatively small power plants and they don't have any hourly monitoring. They're small farms usually, and they just have an electricity meter and they get paid by the electricity meter. But this offers also some potential in order to adapt to the different load conditions if these power plants would be controlled and monitored more accurately than it's now. Same applies also for some hydropower plants. Sometimes these are really small power plants and they don't participate in the flexibility market yet. You'll find these numbers on the internet. I give you at the end of the lecture, I give you the links for those statistics and those graphs. It's another representation by Agora meter. The other was energy charts. So here you see in the red line is the actual consumption. Here you see also a high share of solar, and while due to the lack of flexibility of the conventional power plants, there was overproduction, which led also to negative pricing. Here you see also a representation by a server from SMA, which shows the overall production of solar electricity, but also you can have a representation of the different regions in Germany. So sometimes here was sunny all over Germany, but sometimes you have here and here less production, and you can see it clearly on that website. I'll give you the link also later. Come now to a new area of photovoltaics. We'll call it PV 3.0. This requires that you have free access to the grid, and this is a so-called control power market. This is not the case yet. The prerequisites were quite high, so you have to have a high availability or a high capacity factor. So this was only possible to complete now with some aggregators, so which accumulated a lot of PV power plants with backup power plants and storage. But the idea is here that you can also put this down to a smaller level so everyone can participate in that market in a kind of eBay of energy, a public marketplace. So these people, they can sell the electricity on that market, or during nighttime they can purchase some electricity there, or they can even sell directly to the neighbor. This peer-to-peer trading should be also possible. That's not possible yet. This is just a pure consumer. This is a prosumer here. Also, you can maybe also provider of stored energy. Maybe you have an electric car and you don't need it very often, so you can provide your storage tank or your battery as stored energy. Usually you charge it when the electricity is cheap on the electricity stock market, and you sell it when it's very expensive. Sure, you have to make some calculations because there's some degradation on the battery, but usually you can operate it quite profitably. Same applies for the operator of a PV power plant. No, it cannot absorb energy, we can only sell electricity. Usually, most of the PV power plants are strictly orientated towards south, so they produce electricity all at the same time, and this leads to a drop of the electricity prices during midday and in summer and so on. This may change. I come to this a little bit later. Also, you can provide control power. So this is a very quick available power which is needed within 30 seconds or so, and so you can sell it for a relatively expensive price then. This, interestingly, you have also negative control power. Sometimes you are paid to absorb power. Here another example here with some inflexibility in the grid. So you have here the import and export of electricity, and if you are more flexible, the import-export is reduced also to a more self-sustainable level. We take a look at here now at Fridays, the 2nd of August 2013. There we have accurate measures at the University of Paderborn. So this was a very clear day. So this is our solar irradiance there. It even reached 1000 watt per square meter on around midday, or because it's summertime, it was 1 o'clock. Solar noon is 1 o'clock during summertime. And these are the according electricity prices. Due to the high availability of solar electricity during that date, the prices dropped here. In the morning, as you see here, and the evening, the prices have been really high during that period. So there was a significant change in electricity prices. If you are directly dealing with the stock exchange, your achievable price of electricity is rather low at midday. And if you would be able to generate more in the morning, you would profit from a much higher price here. Also, same applies in the evening. So how quick we can do this? So you don't orientate your module strictly towards south, you orientate it more towards east and west. So if you orientate more towards to the west orientation, so you will have more power in the evening. If you orientate it towards east, you will have more power in the morning. While nothing is really looking directly towards south, you will have less power in the midday and also in total a little bit less yield, but this doesn't matter because the prices are low anyway. And this is a traditional way of installing them, just strictly orientated towards south. This has an additional advantage. If you take a look, usually the winds come from west or north, and this kind of module installation offers a high attack area for high wind speeds, and therefore the statics and the foundations have to be really heavy duty, while here you have a more aerodynamic way of installation, so you can save some money for the foundations and the mounting structure. So therefore, not only because to help the grid a little bit, it's also because of the reduced structural costs. This method became more fashionable. I think you saw in the movie, we saw about Grinner with this 330 megawatt power plant in France. This was also east-west orientation because it reduced the costs, the BOS costs principally. Here you see the effect. So you have the azimuth at 180 degrees. So this is strictly south orientation of your PV power plant at solar noon. And you produce a little in the morning and little in the evening, but most exactly at midday. If you incline your modules more towards east, for example, azimuth 135 southeast, or shift from the strictly south orientation by 45 degrees, you will have the maximum at 920 already. You will, in general, will have a little less yield, but here, to remember, the prices have been really high, and then you would produce less in the midday, in the afternoon. But if you have here westernly orientated modules, for example, tilted more towards southwest with an azimuth of 225 degrees, you will have your maximum at 1440 at slightly increased electricity prices. You can apply the same method also for winter. So you have here the conventional installation at the orange line here. These are the different months. So this is now June, July, where you have most sunshine in Europe. Then you would produce most. Usually you use, this is optimized for summer operation. So you have a module elevation of about 30 degrees. And this is quite good for a sun elevation at midday, about 60 degrees. This is not very helpful because you have an overproduction then in summer. You see this is the gray line. This is a consumption. So you have a little bit reduced consumption in summer because people are on holiday, and also because the electricity needs are a bit lower because you don't have electrical heating so much, and also you have less illumination. So most consumption in winter. But there you have most electricity production. So you will have an overproduction there. And you have a significant gap in winter here of photovoltaic energy production. So how you can overcome this? Just by inclining the PV modules by 60 degrees. This helps a lot. So you have here in summer you will have not such a high production, but more. It looks like a little, but in relative terms it's quite a lot. During the winter months you will have more production in winter because the winter sun, which is only, remember, 14 degrees above the horizon, is much better captured by PV modules with an inclination of 60 degrees. Here you see this not as a curve, but in numbers. So just take as a reference case, pyranometer installed horizontally, as is in most meteorological stations. So you will have a relative energy production in January of 1, and same in July of 1. So calibrated to this 2 months then. And if you would incline it by 30 degrees, which is standard for PV in Germany, you will have 67% more in January. That's really good. So you have significant more rather than having it horizontally. And summer, you still have also a slight advantage of about 2%. If you incline it further to 60 degrees, you will have more than double compared to a horizontal installation in winter only. In summer, you will suffer a little bit. You have about 14% less energy production in summer. Let's come to another method now, which becomes very fashionable for so-called prosumers. They think about installing electricity storage, not only having PV at home, but also about electricity storage. Conventional consumer only, he will consume all electricity from the grid. And if you install PV on your household, these are the numbers here. This is a typical 4-person household in Germany consuming 4,500 kilowatt hours per year, have a PV generator of nominal power of 5 kilowatt and a relatively small storage capacity of 4 kilowatt hour. So first, let's take a look. If you would have PV only, 5 kilowatt of PV only, he would use the grid 30% less. So you'd have to take off 30% of this 4,500 kilowatt hours. 30% would be produced by its own photovoltaics. Then, if you would add the storage here, he would double that amount, so he can store that electricity for nighttime and so on, and he would need only 40% from the grid. That's a good example how to show how this PV plus electrical storage reduce the grid consumption, which is the most expensive now, as I mentioned already, 30 cents in average for households per kilowatt hour, while if you have your own PV electricity in the vicinity of 8 cents or 10 cents, okay, you have to add the storage, which doubles that price about. There's also a thing to mention about the operation of storage in combination with PV. So this would be the simplest storage which helps the consumer but is not very good for the electricity grid. So what we will do, he would consume a lot of the electricity stored in his battery during nighttime. In the morning it's almost empty, the sun goes up, and what we will do, he would use all the energy available in the morning to charge his battery. And at about 10, 11 o'clock his battery is full and he doesn't consume more, and he would feed all that electricity during the peak hours at midday into the grid. You see that there's a high dynamic now here, so here the electricity is not available here. It would be needed desperately because we saw in the morning there is no photovoltaic electricity available for the southern orientated modules, and so you have to have backup power plants there. In the midday hours, the electricity is all fed into the grid, and the grid has to digest that high power. And this leads to additional costs in the transmission. So in the midday hours, you have a high share of photovoltaics in the grid. This high power has to be digested by the grid, and this leads to high costs in the transmission system. While in the morning hours, you have a lack of electricity during those periods. So with this type of operation, you will deliver a high amount of power to the grid during midday, and this would require high transmission costs and would increase the electricity price. Plus, the electricity system suffers by a high dynamic. Here's around 11 o'clock, where it's from 0 to full power. And if you would just feed into the grid only without the battery, you would have a much smoother transition, as indicated here by this dotted line. Much better operation is shown here. So this is more a type of smart battery. That means that in the morning, even if you have almost empty battery, you won't start charging the battery. You would feed all the electricity into the grid because therefore it's most needed, and then start charging only at about 10 o'clock and stop charging in the afternoon only when the battery is full. And this would lead to a clipping of the peak here, and therefore the grid system is much more equalized. So the grid capacity is increased by the reduction of a PV peak injection. This already, to my knowledge, in the state of Baden-Württemberg is already bonused, so you get some extra price if you have such a smart battery operation, which would help the grid, and you will still have the benefit of a battery during nighttime. There is some risk involved. It could be that when the weather is becoming bad at 10 o'clock, you won't be able to charge your battery fully, but you can minimize this risk by a good weather forecast and a smart management system and sufficient storage. But talk about new markets of photovoltaics. So here we see a map of regions which are completely supplied by diesel engines, mainly autonomous systems. These installed capacity is in the vicinity of 500 gigawatt. And meanwhile, photovoltaic is almost always competitive with these diesel power plants. You see that most of the regions which are supplied by diesel are in the sub-Saharan Africa region, some in the Caribbean and in South America, and here in the Southeast Asia. So this is now a calculation for which regions photovoltaic is competitive. This is a quite old study. Unfortunately, there hasn't been any new one. While photovoltaic became much cheaper during that time, the threshold is much higher. So the areas originally in red became green, and green here means that photovoltaic is already competitive. We take some examples here. Sub-Saharan Africa, so mostly green. That means that the cost for diesel generation would be significantly higher than the photovoltaic generation. So even not considering environmental aspects, just economic aspects, photovoltaic would be the best option there. Unfortunately, there are some countries, as I mentioned in a lecture before, Brazil gave some subsidies for diesel generation because they thought diesel generation as the only option to give electricity to people in the Amazon, and they didn't thought about photovoltaic. In the beginning, they didn't give any subsidies for photovoltaics. But nowadays, you don't need any subsidies. You are really competitive on a fair level playing field. So if neither photovoltaics, neither diesel is getting subsidies, you are well off with photovoltaics. Yes, I mentioned PV. This study was from 2011, and since that, the cost of photovoltaic sank from 14 cents per kilowatt hour to 4 cents per kilowatt hour. So the red areas would disappear. The red areas principally are only oil-producing countries like the North Africa, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Nigeria, Indonesia, Venezuela, so on. So this is sure. Diesel is almost for free. But even photovoltaic becomes now competitive there also. It's a quite interesting graphic. So on the x-axis, you see the actual cost of electricity generation in euros per kilowatt hour. Here you see the cost of your PV systems, and here on the y-axis you see the annual irradiance in kilowatt hours per square meter per year. As I mentioned already, in Paderborn it's 950 kilowatt hours per square meter. In Freiburg it's 1,200 kilowatt hours per square meter per year of irradiance. Before we discussed about a system which costs €1 per watt peak, so we keep that here. And as mentioning here in Freiburg, you will come to costs of such a system at €1 per kilowatt hour and 1,200 kilowatt hour per square meter per year of irradiance in the vicinity of 8 cents per kilowatt hour. If the system is getting more expensive, for example, double here, €2 per watt peak, sure, your electricity price is also doubling. The more irradiance you have, the lower the prices. You see here with the lowering of the prices here on the x-axis. What you see here in light blue color is the diesel competition. So here you have the US diesel retail price for 80 cents per liter. On the right side, you have higher prices. Usually US prices are really low, but in many parts of the world, for example, also in Germany, diesel is much more expensive. Therefore, this is the price range you have there, and this influences surely the competitiveness of these diesel power plants. So if you take the lowest diesel price possible here, you are, and you have an Irradiance, for example, as Freiburg, you are competitive even if your PV power plant is quite costly at 2.5 euros per watt peak. You are competitive with a diesel power plant. You can also still work in combination for nighttime. So this is called fuel saving operation of diesel power plants. So you don't need any storage. So you would have the diesel power plant idle during daytime and switch it on during nighttime. And then you can have a very cheap installation costs of your photovoltaic systems because you don't have to apply storage costs. If you go to heavy fuel oil, so usually only very huge power plants are able to apply that, you have a bit lower costs. Crude oil is even cheaper. These are costs from 2011. If you see the nowadays, they didn't change so much. So the crude oil here was about $80 per barrel. Nowadays it's at $72 per barrel. The diesel in the US was $0.80 per liter. Now it's at $0.84 per liter. Diesel average world price was about $1 per liter. So here it's quite good to see the competitiveness and the maximum price you are able to install your PV power plant for. We come to other markets. While the expression power plant doesn't have to apply for PV because you can integrate photovoltaics in the city infrastructure. You can make solar carports, you can integrate it into roofs, into facades and so on. And this we will discuss in the following chapter. This is an older example from the 90s in Berlin. This was a 17 kilowatt photovoltaic power plant, nicely integrated in a facade. Nowadays, the prices of photovoltaics are quite cheap. So if you see this is mirror-like facade, probably is more expensive than the photovoltaic module installed there. Particularly this facade had an additional advantage because you don't see it here. There is a river here flowing below, and this river reflected some sunlight on the facade. Plus here you see some reflection from here. So due to this albedo enhancement, the power delivery of that power plant was more than expected. This is a parking house in Saxony, so the whole roof is covered with a photovoltaic, giving a very homogeneous structure, a very homogeneous look. Here's a double use of photovoltaics, so not only the facade, but also have some shading elements for photovoltaics. In summer, when the sun is really high, it makes some shading in these office rooms and therefore reduce the necessities of air conditioners there. This is a flat roof. During that time it was installed in the year 2002. This was the largest photovoltaic roof with 1 megawatt at that time. This is quite nicely made. It was also used as a control for light here. You see here the different modules, and sometimes you see free areas. You even have several densities of the coverage by photovoltaic sense, and therefore the architect designed with the light, so we have a quite homogeneous illumination in that building inside. You see it here, so you have here open, here the light come in at a very high intensity. Here you have coverage, some shading by photovoltaics, and here even more, while the density of the photovoltaics has been more. During that time, it was even a world record because 10,000 square meters of roof have been covered by photovoltaic elements. You can also use them to cover car roofs, as you see below. There's one startup from Munich students, Sonos. They make a car which can run for about 30 kilometers a day only by photovoltaics. You don't have to have electricity refueling station for that if you are not using the car constantly. Maybe only 10 or 20 kilometers a day, that's totally sufficient. Fortunately, it's not on the market yet, but this looks quite promising. But even for conventional cars, in order to save costs for air conditioning and so on, you can have a photovoltaic roof. Here there's some futuristic outlook, so how you can integrate photovoltaics into the building or even in the city design. Also, if you go one step further, there's even photovoltaic landscapes. So there are even landscape architects thinking about photovoltaics, how to shape landscapes and to make them look nicely. I've been talking about the links already. I put all the different links here on our homepage from the university. So you find there a lot of information about actual German grid conditions, but also about other countries on the next page. So there's one officially by the so-called Bundesnetzagentur, which gives the actual grid conditions. So what's the actual supply, what's the actual need, which power plants are involved. There's also by Energy Charge, which goes into more details. This is operated by the Fraunhofer Institute in Freiburg. There is one also with the different power plants and the monthly and yearly power generation. If you use that link, you will find all those data there. As I mentioned, we extended that to many other countries besides Germany. So also find about prices, CO2 emissions, not only over the whole year, but actual CO2 emissions. Usually there's a bit delay, about 2 hours, because the operators of those websites, they want to make money by selling the really accurate data or the minutely data to some paying customers. But if you wait for 1 or 2 hours, you get this data for free. Yes, that's it. Please prepare the exercise at home. Also, if you like the video, please give it a like. Please let me know how you can improve those kind of lectures. Thank you very much.